This video will only tell Regis' story, not vampires in general. If you'd like to know more about the vampires in the Witcher world, please view my vampire-specific series instead.
Should you learn where the Elder dwells, do whisper a word to the ravens. I'll come and help.
Even though that could mean you'll fight Detloff?
Even though.
Emil Regis Rohelek Terzieff-Godefroy is both a monster in the eyes of men and one of Geralt's dearest friends. With Regis being a higher vampire, you might wonder how that ever happened, given a Witcher's tendency to hunt vampires. Well, it all began on a moonlit night, during a stroll across an elven graveyard. Geralt, at the time, was accompanied by several other people. Milva, an archer working with the Scoia'tael, Dandelion the bard, of course, and Zoltan the dwarf with his gnome companion, Percival, with a group of refugees in tow. Our Witcher was still searching for Ciri at this point, and didn't see an elven graveyard as much of a deterrent from his path. And so it was that our little group was suddenly met with a very strong scent of herbs? As it turned out, Regis was hiding nearby, not entirely too eager to be found. The strong herbs were meant to mask his vampire scent. After all, animals could pick up on his vampiric nature otherwise, though sometimes they still did, herbs or no. Regis introduced himself as a man from Dillingen, where he practiced the profession of surgeon, and Zoltan, realizing that a medic might come in handy on their journey, invited Regis to travel with them, and it was safer to travel in numbers anyway. However, Regis wasn't a refugee himself, as they might have expected, and he did not flee Dillingen because of the war. In fact, for now he lived in this cemetery. Now, this somewhat surprised our friends, of course. Who lives on a graveyard except ghouls and wraiths and vampires? Regis had a little hut not far from where they'd met, in addition to his house and shop in Dillingen, of course. He'd spent his summer on the cemetery every year from June to September to collect medicinal herbs and roots to distill elixirs. That doesn't mean he's ignorant of the war, of course. Refugees came through constantly, as there was a camp not far from there. But he wasn't scared of the war, nor was he scared of possible ghouls in the graveyard. And this is where one of his most characteristic traits shows itself for the first time. Regis always seems to know everything about everything. So too about the habits of monsters. Eyeing Geralt, who was just introduced as a Witcher, he explained in his soon-to-be customary tone that this necropolis was over half a millennium old. Ghouls aren't picky, but after 500 years of chewing on old bones, they'd all left. With all this said and done, Zoltan invites Regis to at least join them at their camp for some cold horse meat. But Regis has a better idea. His little house wasn't big, but it should still be cozier than camping out in the middle of a graveyard. And while initially the group had doubts, especially Zoltan, who thought Regis might be a grave robber, stealing valuables hidden in the tombs, or a mad professor experimenting on corpses, they eventually realized that Regis hadn't been entirely honest. The medicinal herbs he was looking for turned out to be mainly mandrake roots, which he used to make some exceptionally strong alcohol.
It will take them some time nonetheless, so perhaps you'd care for a snifter of mandrake.
Rarely say no to a snifter.
Sadly, this is but a weak infusion rather than a proper distillate.
Even better. I remember your mandrake hooch. Made people say things they'd have rather kept to themselves.
This immediately dispelled Zoltan's doubts, as good alcohol seemed to do, and Percival was especially impressed with Regis's self-made distillation setup. Mandrake, you should know, was incredibly expensive and incredibly poisonous when not prepared properly. But after Regis assured Geralt and Zoltan that he had taken very good care in preparing the moonshine, and that mandrake was plentiful in this graveyard, which is exactly why he sat here all summer, they were happy to drink what was probably the best alcohol they would ever taste, even though Regis apologized profusely for the drink not being entirely up to the best standard he'd hoped for yet. Most surprisingly, however, Regis didn't drink any alcohol himself. He wouldn't even take a sip. As he said, it's a matter of principle, and Regis never violates the principles he'd set for himself. They spend the night talking about this or that, like the various insane methods of harvesting mandrake roots and Geralt's wounds, which Regis could tell quite easily had been treated in Broccolon. He could smell the medicine in Geralt's sweat. After they'd all gotten rather sufficiently drunk, Regis decided to join the gang on their journey anyway. Apparently, Zoltan had convinced him that the war sweeping around his little graveyard was far more serious than he'd thought, and after several more stiff drinks, Regis was told that they were not on their way to Mahakam, as he might have thought, but instead they were on their way to Nilfgaard to find Ciri, and Regis was now officially part of the rescue party. The next morning, when the company went on their way again, still hungover from last night's drinking fest, they met a group of peasants from the Chotla refugee camp, halfway through the cemetery. They were apparently hunting a local vampire, accused of killing some peasants nearby. After some back and forth where they argued over a horse, superstitions, and women, Milva punched one of them in the face and they all agreed to travel to the refugee camp instead. Though not before Milva threw up, again, earning Geralt a strange look from Regis. Regis, with his vast knowledge, had already guessed that Milva might be pregnant, though the rest of the group was still rather oblivious. On their way to the camp, they discussed the possibility of a vampire at length, and Regis, of course, has some very specific information on them, impressing even Geralt with his knowledge and assuring everyone that no vampire committed these killings. Not that this set off any alarm bells with Geralt yet, mind you. Once they arrive at the camp and drop off their little group of refugees, they, unsurprisingly, run into yet more trouble. The peasants from earlier came back to complain about how hard Milva punched their friend, and it seems that a young girl is about to get burned at the stake for fraternizing with the evil vampire. All nonsense, of course, and Regis used some very expensive words to describe how eye-rollingly stupid the priest inciting the mob was. The current mayor of the camp, called Lab, seemed more level-headed and demanded proof of all the wild accusations. Of course, as there wasn't any, the priest eventually demanded they torture a confession out of the girl. This went too far for Geralt and our friends, so Geralt suggested a trial by ordeal instead, which the priest refused because Geralt was a godless creature, at which point Zoltan and Milva also presented themselves. And so it was that the priest set an impossible trial for the group: grab a burning hot horse iron from the flames without getting burned. Zoltan was about ready to at least attempt it when Regis intervened. He casually sauntered towards the fire, reached in, and grabbed the horseshoe without issue. In no hurry at all, he then approached the priest and held out the horseshoe to him, noting that he supposed this meant the girl was innocent. God's verdict and all. Regis didn't have a single burn wound on his hands. You won't be surprised to hear that the priest then instead tried to call Regis a witch or a devil incarnate, to which Regis coldly replied that if that's the case, he should probably perform an exorcism on him. No time for that, though, it seemed, as in the midst of this farce, Nilfgaard suddenly attacked the camp. Complete chaos ensued, as not only Nilfgaard arrived, but a regime of Temeria also entered the scene. That last party won the battle eventually, but Geralt and Dandelion got separated from the rest of the gang and were captured by said Temerians. Lucky for them, Regis had seen where they were taken and finds Milva and Cahir, a Nilfgaardian, with their horses. He tells them where Geralt and Dandelion are held, and they go on their way to help. Once they arrive near the camp, Regis told the others he'd be able to handle this himself. Cahir, who hadn't met Regis before, of course, had some scruples with Regis's boldness. "How arrogant is that?" Cahir muttered to Milva when they came close to each other, dismounting. "He'll get them out of trouble by himself, without anyone's help. Did you hear that? Who is he? In truth, I don't know, Milva muttered back. But when it comes to impossible tasks, I believe him. Yesterday, in front of my very eyes, he got a red-hot horseshoe out of a fire with his bare hands. Is he a sorcerer? No, Regis answered from behind Pegasus, demonstrating his exceptionally sensitive hearing. But does it really matter who I am? After all, I haven't asked for your personal details. I am Kahir Mamr Diffrin Epkalak. I thank you, and am full of admiration. The barber surgeon's voice had a slight note of scorn. I heard almost no Nilfgaardian accent when you pronounced your Nilfgaardian surname. I'm not... Enough! Milva cut him off. This isn't the time for arguing or hesitating. Regis, the Witcher's waiting to be rescued. Not before midnight, the barber surgeon said, coldly, looking up at the moon. They didn't know he was a vampire, so they didn't know that he was about to simply fly into the camp. Geralt, meanwhile, was sitting about, thinking about Yennefer when his medallion started to shake violently. Regis had arrived using his bat form, of course, as it was a full moon. He'd put the guards to sleep with his hypnotic powers and walked in to save our two friends. When Regis changed back into his human form, Geralt's medallion stopped shaking entirely, but from that point on, Geralt knew what Regis was. After the vampire freed them, Geralt told him it would be best if they did not meet again. Regis understood and left. Unfortunately, during their daring escape from the Temerian camp after that, Dandelion was struck in the head, and a nasty wound promised one hell of a headache for the group. But just then, Regis again appeared out of nowhere to help. When he removed the makeshift bandages from Dandelion's wound, he noted that his blood smelled good, which caused Geralt to make some shifty movements. He grabbed his sword and told Regis to get away from Dandelion, but Regis clarified that he simply meant the blood wasn't infected. Once Regis was done, Geralt immediately put a sword to his neck, which left Regis entirely unfazed. It was at that point that Milva finally noticed that Regis's eyes shone like a cat in the darkness. Dandelion tries to reason with Geralt, noting that Regis saved them both from the gallows, and he'd healed his head wound. He also saved that girl at the camp, as Milva reminded him. Though saying that, she now also noted that Regis didn't cast a shadow. The vampire then introduced himself again, formally this time, as Emil Regis Rohelic Terzieff-Godefroy, 428 years according to humans, 642 years according to elves. He was a descendant of the surviving vampires stuck in this world after the conjunction of spheres. But Geralt didn't rightly care about Regis's history. He told him to get out of there, to which Regis mockingly asked him whether he was really just letting him go. Him, a threat to humans? In the end, Geralt was a witcher, and he would have to hunt the vampire down eventually. Geralt admitted that he couldn't deny that if there was a reward, he might. Regis wished him luck with that, but before he left, he casually wondered how much a contract would have to pay to hunt him down. Bloody high. You tickle my vanity, to be precise. Fuck off, Regis. I'm going, but first, put a value on me, if you please. I've usually taken the equivalent of a good saddle horse for an ordinary vampire, but you, after all, are not ordinary. How much? I doubt, the Witcher said, his voice as cold as ice. I doubt whether anyone could afford it. I understand, and thank you, the vampire said, smiling. This time he bared his teeth. At the sight, Milva and Kahir stepped back, and Dandelion stifled a cry of horror. Farewell. Good luck. Farewell, Regis. Same to you. Emil Regis Rohelic Terzieff-Godefroy shook his cape, wrapped himself up in it with a flourish, and vanished. He simply vanished. Not long after Regis left them, Geralt had another one of his little spats and decided he wanted to travel on alone. But as Dandelion and Milva get annoyed with their Witcher companion yet again, Regis once more shows up out of nowhere. Geralt, now exceedingly bothered, tries to make him go away, but Regis insists he must change Dandelion's bandage. But first, they have a short talk. Or rather, Regis wonders why Geralt's people skills are so terribly lacking. The vampire tried to tell him that it was okay to accept the help of others, but our stubborn Witcher wouldn't hear of it, so instead, Regis saunters off to sit with Dandelion and Milva. And when they start making fun of Geralt's sulking, Regis is actually the one to tell them to be more discreet. They decide to make some soup in the meantime, and it doesn't take long for the conversation to turn to the problem at hand, finding Ciri. They had no clue where she was now, as Cahir had informed them the one in Nilfgaard was a fake. Thankfully, Regis had friends among the Druids, and he suggested they visit them to ask for aid in finding Ciri. They had just agreed that this was a wonderful idea when Geralt had another temper tantrum and wondered out loud if anyone was going to ask him about his opinion in the matter. Dandelion, all tact and grace, notes that Geralt didn't know what he was doing anyway, so they might as well give this a try. You'll have noticed that the original party had now grown 2 members. Regis, the vampire, who wasn't quite ready to leave yet, and Cahir, the Nilfgaardian. Geralt was suspicious about Cahir for being the Nilfgaardian that Ciri had nightmares about, but everyone else was more worried about the vampire in their midst. They come to Geralt with questions, but he states he doesn't intend to kill Regis, and if he had wanted to drink their blood, he'd had ample opportunity by now. Regis, being a higher vampire, was certainly extremely dangerous, and if he was their enemy, Geralt would be afraid as well. But for whatever reason, Regis was helping them. And Geralt wasn't about to reject help in finding Ciri. But aside from that, Geralt also finds Regis an honorable man, not in the least for helping the girl in the camp, though he knew it could expose him as a vampire. Truth be told, even Geralt, as a Witcher, didn't know everything there was to know about higher vampires. Elusive as they were, they are much like humans, each different in many ways, though Geralt suspects that even among vampires, Regis is unusual, as he'd convincingly posed as a human for so many years. From Regis's earlier escapades, we could surmise that he's impervious to fire, he can become invisible whenever he wants, hypnotize you with his eyes, or transform into a bat and fly off. If it ever came down to it, Geralt wasn't sure he was even capable of killing Regis. He'd rather not have to try, but given his limited knowledge, Geralt suggests they simply ask Regis. The next day, Dandelion took that advice to heart. Sort of. When he tried to trick Regis into answers. "Milva!" he suddenly called as they were riding, sneaking a glance at the vampire. "Why don't you ride on ahead with your bow and bring down a fawn or wild boar? I've had enough of damned blackberries and mushrooms, fish and mussels. I fancy eating a hunk of real meat for a change. How about you, Regis?" "I beg your pardon?" the vampire said, lifting his head from the horse's neck. "Meat!" the poet repeated emphatically. "I'm trying to persuade Milva to go hunting. Fancy some fresh meat?" "Yes, I do." "And blood! Would you like some fresh blood?" Blood?" Regis asked, swallowing. "No, I'll decline the blood, but if you have a taste for some, feel free." Geralt, Milva, and Cahir observed an awkward, sepulchral silence. "I know what this is about, Dandelion," Regis said slowly, "and let me reassure you, I'm a vampire, but I don't drink blood." The silence became as heavy as lead, but Dandelion wouldn't have been Dandelion if he had remained silent. "You must have misunderstood me," he said, seemingly light-heartedly. "I didn't mean—" "I don't drink blood," Regis interrupted. "Haven't for many years. I gave it up." "What do you mean, gave it up?" "Just that. I really don't understand. Forgive me. It's a personal matter." "But, Dandelion!" the Witcher burst out, turning around in the saddle. Regis just told you to fuck off. He just said it more politely. Be so good as to shut your trap. But of course, the mystery couldn't quite remain. So that night, Regis decided to explain why he doesn't drink blood anymore. As it turns out, he used to drink far too much blood. You see, blood is like alcohol to vampires, and Regis was an alcoholic. His peers only encouraged this behavior, and even made fun of him for it. But Regis kept drinking anyway because he was afraid of losing social acceptance. He was trying his best to fit in with his fellow vampires. In the vampire society, parenting isn't really a thing, so no one set boundaries. As he kept drinking more and more, he became more and more savage, until the people didn't matter anymore. He just wanted to drink. Eventually, he met another vampire, and they began a relationship, a rather serious one. Regis stopped losing control on his drinking binges for a while, but not for too long. Not able to cope with his drinking problem, she left him and Regis began to drink even more, using disappointment and grief as a justification for his behavior. Then, one night, it went too far, and he crashed straight into a wall while drunk flying and distracted by a pretty girl. The villagers cut him into pieces so thoroughly that, though they can't kill him of course, it took him roughly 50 years to recover. At that point, he figured it was perhaps time to stop drinking altogether. They discussed the fears and myths surrounding vampires and the human psyche for a while, until the subject of regeneration is broached. Humans, Geralt said, smiling slightly, are a primitive and superstitious race. They find it difficult to fully understand and appropriately name a creature that resurrects. Even though it's had stakes pushed through it, had its head removed and been buried in the ground for 50 years. Yes, indeed, said the vampire, impervious to the derision. Your mutated race is capable of regenerating its fingernails, toenails, hair, and epidermis, but is unable to accept the fact that other races are more advanced in that respect. That inability is not the result of your primitiveness, quite the opposite. It's a result of egotism and conviction in your own perfection. Anything that is more perfect than you must be a repulsive aberration, and repulsive aberrations are consigned to myths for sociological reasons. For a while, their journey then continues without issue, though signs of the war are everywhere, until they eventually run into Zoltan and his crew again, and again they were escorting several refugees, this time from the camp that was previously attacked. Among them was the girl, believed to be a witch by the priest, but saved by Regis. Unfortunately, the crazed priest had tried to light the fire in the chaos, and the girl had a nasty burn wound. Regis, of course, gladly offered his aid, but she simply would not sit still. So Regis decided to hypnotize her, to calm her down. But as he worked on her wound, it seemed that the girl was also a seeress, and Regis's hypnotizing spells brought out her prophetic powers. We're heading east, to Keddu, to the Druid's circle. We're counting on the Druid's help. No help, said the girl with the bandaged arm in a ringing, metallic voice. No help, only blood and a baptism of fire. Fire purifies, but also kills. Zoltan was dumbfounded. Regis gripped his arm tightly and gestured him to remain silent. Geralt, who could recognize a hypnotic trance, said nothing and did not move. He who has spilt blood and he who has drunk blood, the girl said, her head still lowered, shall pay in blood. Within 3 days one shall die in the other, and something shall die in each. They shall die inch by inch, piece by piece. And when finally the iron-shod clogs wear out and the tears dry, then the last shreds will pass. Even that which never dies shall die. Speak on, Regis said, softly and gently. What can you see? Fog. A tower in the fog. It is the Tower of Swallows, on a lake bound by ice. What else do you see? Fog. What do you feel? Pain. Geralt started to respect Regis a great deal more after this event, though Dandelion still thought his name was ridiculous and long. Regardless, after traveling on, Milva could no longer hide the fact that she was pregnant. She took Regis into the forest for a consultation, so to speak, and asked him to make her a potion that would allow her to miscarriage. In short, she asked him to perform an abortion. Regis decided to ask the rest of the group what they thought of this decision, as Milva would be unable to travel for some time afterwards. Cahir noted that in Nilfgaard it is only ever up to the woman what happens to her body in that situation. The group seems to agree with that, and Geralt asks Regis to simply give her the potion when she next asks. However, Regis states that he had already decided on that regardless, but he was quite sure that Milva wanted to talk to Geralt before she made her final decision. He was right, of course, and after a talk with Geralt, Milva decided to keep the baby anyway. But as Milva was pregnant, Geralt no longer wished to travel through the dangerous Isgith swamp. Regis objected, noting that despite her pregnancy, Milva was quite healthy and completely functional. She would also be quite annoyed if she realized Geralt was trying to protect her. And on top of that, the armies roaming the hills were dangerous also, and time was running out. Geralt had told him to shut up when he began listing these points, but Regis is a vampire, and you don't shut up a vampire. At least, not Regis the vampire. Regardless, Geralt was not willing to risk Milva's child at any cost, and so they decided to cross the Yaruga and travel upriver. If push came to shove, they could always travel together, Geralt and Regis, with Regis flying as a bat. Regis did inform Geralt that he could only fly during a full moon, however, which was 2 weeks away. Not too far off in Geralt's book, so Regis affectionately calls him a strange man and agrees to his plan. So they find a boat with a rather uncooperative ferryman who becomes a great deal more cooperative when threatened by our good friends, and they float down the river, while getting attacked from both banks, suddenly appearing Lyrian guerrillas on one side and Nilfgaard on the other. Regis got shot in the chest once, causing Milva to start an angry killing spree on the Nilfgaardians with her bow, but of course as a vampire, the arrow in his chest was barely noticeable. Though that still surprised Geralt and Milva for some reason. Eventually they land and are forced to fight the Nilfgaardians, winning in the end. But Milva, through stress it seems, miscarries on the shore. Regis performs an on-site abortion in an effort to save her life, and thankfully succeeds. And so their road went on. Milva recovered quickly and took to swearing loudly at Regis when he kept answering questions she wasn't even finished asking, which made him drop that habit quickly, though he gave sound advice and facts when he did speak up. Eventually, their road led to a beekeeper village. The beekeeper in question surprised the party when he walked out of the bushes, as he was quite hairy and you could easily mistake him for a werewolf. Ironically, Regis was actually the one to jump up and scream, "A werewolf! A werewolf!" when the man did show his face. As it turned out, the Druids had left Cadou not long ago, but the beekeepers were quite sure they'd left towards the slopes. As chance would have it, the beekeepers would love to travel that way too, with an escort, of course. And though they had in fact lied about the Druids' traveling direction, of course, because they had no idea in fact, Regis noted that it wouldn't rightly matter much. The Druids might have left for the slopes, they might not have. As Regis put it is better to go forward without a goal than to have a goal and stay in one place, and it is certainly better than to stay in one place without a goal. They find themselves in Toussaint soon enough, near Mount Gorgon, and found out where the Druids actually were, at Loch Mundian. In the little town of Riedbrunn, they pick up another member to their little gang, Angoulême. And through Angoulême, they also find out that someone's been spying on them. Someone who knows more than them. We know, of course, that it is Vilgefortz using Yennefer's mind to spy on Geralt's little group, but Geralt doesn't know this and confides in Regis that he believes one of their own is a traitor. Namely, Cahir. Regis noted that perhaps Angoulême, who had revealed to them this information of a spy, might just be lying. They had only just met, after all, to which Angoulême objected, but Regis stayed remarkably calm. In the end, Geralt still accuses Cahir of spying on them, which, unsurprisingly, results in a fight, though of course Regis fiercely objected to the accusations in the first place. The fight was loud enough to attract attention in the end, and Regis, when everyone calmed down, suggested they never, ever come back to this subject. At this point, they finally realize what's really going on. The spy could only ever be using magic, as their reports didn't include Regis. A vampire was undetectable through magical means. Geralt and Cahir mend their shaky friendship, and they go on their way. Geralt had devised a plan, which had them split up in an attempt to lure out the half-elf who might have information on Ciri. However, the mission goes awry somewhat, and Cahir ends up with a scalped skull. This impeded their movement somewhat, so Regis rode back to meet them and lead Geralt to a nearby cave. As it turns out, Regis had already met with the Druids in the meantime, near Toussaint, and they'd informed him that Geralt was to enter this specific cave, alone and without weapons. Geralt begrudgingly agreed after some stern words from Regis, and met with the elf Avalach inside the cave, who gave him some but not many of the answers he was looking for. Unfortunately, while Geralt was stuck in the cave, his friends were attacked by Shiryu the half-elf and his cronies. Little did they know they were now in Druid's domain, and they did not take kindly to burning the woods and murder. One thing led to another, and Shiryu and his were captured by the Druids and subsequently burned to death, preventing Geralt from finding his answers. Now quite out of options, with a wounded Cahir and Milva from the Druid shenanigans, and a headache, Geralt decided to rest in Toussaint for a while. Regis didn't much like the idea of that. As a vampire, he tried to avoid large cities wherever he could, but he supposed he would just have to be very aware of sorcerers, telepaths, mirrors, and dogs, and if all else failed, he'd have to count on Geralt to save him. "You can count on me," Geralt said seriously. "I'm not in the habit of leaving a friend in need." The vampire smiled, and because they were alone, he did not hide his fangs. "Friend?" "The anthropomorphism speaks through my mouth. Come on, let's get out of this cave, my friend, because here we will only find rheumatism." And so off to Toussaint they went, where Regis seemed to blend in perfectly with his sharp wit and quick tongue. The noble ladies loved him, and he talked our friends out of several problems in the process, such as citing about 100 precedents to the Chamberlain, so Milva could wear male clothes instead of a dress. He also took care of a small succubus problem for Geralt, by dating said succubus for the duration of their stay in Toussaint. Though despite his efforts to blend in, he somehow still decided to wear a black velvet jacket to the banquets, making him look very much like a vampire, while he discussed the various ways of killing vampires with his table companions. Unfortunately, as time passed, Geralt became rather preoccupied with sleeping with Fringilla Vigo and picking up random Witcher contracts, and the rest of the group was getting somewhat restless. Eventually, that restlessness turned into an argument between Regis and Fringilla. She tried to convince the group to let Geralt stay in Toussaint, perhaps forever. She was all too happy to keep the Witcher for herself, though at that time she was mostly keeping him preoccupied for the lodge. But Regis wouldn't have any of that. "If it is written in the scrolls of destiny," the sorceress said after a moment, "that Geralt will win Ciri back, then it shall happen, irrespective of whether the Witcher goes into the mountains or whether he stays in Toussaint. Destiny catches up with people, and not the other way around. Do you understand that? Do you understand that, Lord Regis Terzieff-Godefroy?" "Better than you think, Madame Vigo," The vampire twiddled the wooden peg from the sausage. But for me, please forgive me, destiny isn't a scroll written on by a great demiurge, nor the will of the heaven, nor the inevitable verdict of some providence or other, but the result of many apparently unconnected facts, events, and occurrences. I would be inclined to agree with you that destiny catches up with people, and not just people. But the view that it can't be the other way around doesn't convince me, for such a view is facile fatalism, a paean-praising torpor and indolence, a warm ire-down and the beguiling warmth of a woman's loins. In short, life in a dream. And life, Madame Vigo, may be a dream, may also finish as a dream, but it's a dream that has to be dreamed actively, which is why, Madame Vigo, the road awaits us. Suit yourselves! Fringilla stood up, almost as suddenly as Milva a moment earlier. As you wish! Blizzards, frost, and destiny awaits you in the mountain passes, and the expiation you so sorely search for. Suit yourselves! But the Witcher shall stay here in Toussaint with me! I think, the vampire said calmly, that you are wrong, Madame Vigo. The dream that the Witcher is dreaming, I humbly submit with respect, is an enchanting and beautiful one. But every dream, if dreamed too long, turns into a nightmare, and we awake from such dreams screaming. And indeed, that morning Geralt stumbles upon a new path to take, and eagerly drags his party from Toussaint and back onto the road to Ciri. Regis breaks off his affair with the succubus, and they travel through the snowy peaks to Castle Stygga and Vilgefortz. At the castle, Regis was the first to be seen, or rather smelled through his herbs. Staring at the guards, he used his hypnotic powers once more to politely request they open the gate, and so they did. Our murderous party then rode into the courtyard, and after a moment dead bodies littered the ground. As they cut their way through the castle, Regis instead flew off to find Ciri. When he found her, she was being restrained by Vilgefortz's minions, though not for long. Regis, as a giant bat, swooped in and men started dropping like flies under his talons. Eventually, he sat down comfortably in the iron chair meant for Ciri, while sucking the blood out of one of Vilgefortz's minions. His eyes had turned an onyx black when he looked at Ciri and sheepishly explained that sometimes he just couldn't resist a drink. He introduced himself as a friend of Geralt and asked to take her back to the Witcher, but Ciri refused. She wanted to find Yennefer and told Regis only to warn Geralt that Vilgefortz was here. When Regis returned to relay the message, Milva had already fallen in battle. Regis, sinister smile on his face, noted he was quite ready to smash the castle down whole. Geralt preferred he didn't, but sent him off to the upper levels to stir up trouble anyhow. It might have been a better idea to keep him around, however, as they soon ran into Bonhart, and one by one the fellowship fell, until only Geralt was left, who, after finding Yennefer, now faced Vilgefortz. But even together, they were no match for the sorcerer. He was about to murder Yennefer when Regis's giant bat form quietly rushed at Vilgefortz. And before he could raise a protection spell, Regis violently attacked his face. Unfortunately, powerful as he was, even Regis was no match. He didn't believe he could die, of course, but Vilgefortz was quite able to do the next best thing. When Regis leapt at the wizard again, Vilgefortz's hands heated up like red-hot irons as he pressed them tightly around Regis's face. These flames were not of this world. The vampire screamed. Geralt cried out and tried to save him, but it was too late. Regis was pushed into a column, burning with white fire. Regis screamed again. He screamed so loud that the Witcher had to cover his ears with his hands. The windows shattered and the column simply melted, Regis melting with it into a shapeless stone. Eventually, Vilgefortz was defeated, but it had cost Geralt his friends. All of them. Milva, Cahir, Angoulême, and Regis. She fell silent, glanced at the remains of the melted column, in which the outline of a shape could be discerned. Who was that? Geralt? A friend. I'm going to miss him. And here ends the story of Regis, at least in the books. We do in fact meet his ex-girlfriend in The Witcher 1. She's running a brothel, it seems, where one pays in blood, not coin. Well, technically both. She tells us she's happy to know that he at least had friends when he died. But as we all know, in Blood and Wine he returns once again, restored by Dettlaff through a vampiric ritual, known only to higher vampires. He once again stands by Geralt's side as they attempt to uncover the mysteries of Toussaint. And he also seems to have taken up drinking alcohol this lifetime around. Not unsurprising considering his near-death experience, I suppose. And as before, Regis supports Geralt even if it could potentially cost him his life. And this time for real. He risks being found out as a vampire, facing the vampire elder, and even Dettlaff, his higher vampire brother. All for Geralt. He'll even kill Dettlaff if it comes to that. And doing so makes him an outcast among vampires, even more so than he really already was. Outside of adventuring shenanigans, however, he seems content perusing tomes in his necropolis hideout, brewing medicine and the like, wondering about humans and their habits. But through it all, Regis very clearly struggles with his place in the world, pretending to be something he's not, a human, just to be accepted, to stop from being hunted. It's tiring, very tiring. And through his efforts, he now no longer feels at home with either human or vampire. And while he speaks fondly of a friend who taught him that perhaps humans aren't all bad, it's clear he sometimes doubts his decisions. In his little home on the graveyard near Toussaint, we find something of a diary of his, where he writes down anything he thinks of, it seems. It reads thusly: My last thought before falling asleep. If there is no death, does life exist? Hate is a very interesting feeling. I have noticed that people improve themselves with it to great effect. Sometimes I would like to stop thinking. If we were to create a god as the humans have, what would he be like? People justify bad deeds by good intentions. I'm not sure if there is greater idiocy. I would drink the freshly squeezed blood of an infant. I know I can't, but I hope that its velvety taste will send me to sleep. I strive to live like a person, and it means that I have ceased to feel good among people as well as among my own. Maybe I made a big mistake. I have always wanted to write. I am very tired, and fuck it all. People don't think about the present. They usually remember old times or worry about the future. I have a feeling that my friend Dettlaff will die. I am sad. Regis tries very hard to fit in, but as a vampire, he never truly will. Not with ordinary folk. For his sake, and the sake of every vampire in the Witcher world, let's hope that one day the gate to the world of vampires will indeed open once more, and perhaps he can go home and finally feel truly happy again.
Think that went better than... You kidding? I'd have been dead on the spot if not for my slowed metabolism.
And yet you survived, though you are risking your life. The question is, why? This contract, it goes well beyond what witches customarily handle. I cannot abandon the matter, for Dettlaff and I are bound by blood, but you could simply walk away. So why, my friend? Why stay and risk your hide?
For you. You're in a heap of trouble, Regis. Trouble Dettlaff brought on. Seen you die once already. That one time was enough.
I'm not certain I know what to say. I am grateful, Geralt.